Great news! Mr Gardiner has found Lydia and Wickham. OK, so they're not married, but they could be soon if Mr Bennet agrees to pledge a small yearly sum for Lydia and confirm her inheritance. Mr Gardiner also reports that Wickham's financial situation is stabilising. His debts will soon be repaid, and there'll even be some money left over. All Mr Bennet needs to do is give Mr Gardiner permission to act on his behalf, and he'll get this marriage over the line. Phew! The Bennets' family honour is saved. Except it's obvious that Mr Gardiner has stumped up the money to discharge Wickham's debts and sweeten the deal. How will the Bennets ever repay him? When Elizabeth and Jane tell their mother, she's overwhelmed with joy. She forgets that Lydia eloped and disgraced the family and can't wait to tell everyone that Lydia will now be a bride. Hey team, just a reminder, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel out, and our next upload could be on something taught in your next class. Thanks, and back to the video. Elizabeth can see the advantage of the marriage, but how can Lydia be happy in the long run? Because, let's face it, Wickham is one of the most worthless young men in Great Britain. Oh, if only Elizabeth hadn't blabbed to Mr Darcy about Lydia's scandalous elopement. Then again, even if Wickham and Lydia had courted and married by the book, Mr Darcy would still avoid any connection to the Bennets due to his aversion to Wickham. The thing is, Elizabeth now realises that if things had worked out between her and Darcy, they would have been perfect for each other. When the Bennets hear from Mr Gardiner again, it's to learn that Wickham will transfer to a regiment in northern England. Of course, this means that once he and Lydia are married, they will live a very long way away from Longbourn. Everyone agrees that this is the best outcome, except Mrs Bennet, who assumed that Lydia would live in a grand home nearby. Dream on, Mrs B. However, before the newlyweds head north, they'll stay at Longbourn for over a week. Oh, goody. When Mr and Mrs Wickham arrive, the only one who's excited to see them is Mrs Bennet. The easy-breezy audacity of the newlyweds is quite shocking, especially for Mr Bennet, Jane and Elizabeth. But Lydia seems oblivious to anything but her own happiness and her dear Wickham. Lydia's boastful ignorance is so excruciating that, at one point, Elizabeth runs out of the room. When she returns, she overhears Lydia insist that she must sit in Jane's place at the dining table because she's a married woman now. That may be so, but Elizabeth can see that Wickham isn't that into Lydia, but Lydia is crazy about him. She insists on telling Jane and Elizabeth all about the wedding, even though they don't want to hear it. As expected, Mr and Mrs Gardiner had done everything as promised, although Lydia resented their efforts to protect and reason with her. But then Lydia drops something that catches Elizabeth's attention. Mr Darcy had been present at the wedding ceremony. What on earth was he doing there? It was meant to be a secret, so Elizabeth doesn't ask any questions. But she's burning to know, so she writes to her aunt, Mrs Gardiner, for an explanation. Elizabeth receives a quick reply and goes outside to read it in private. The truth is, Mr Darcy was the one who discovered Lydia and Wickham. He left Derbyshire the day after Elizabeth and got intel on the fugitives through one of Wickham's old associates. Mr Darcy felt responsible because he'd always known that Wickham was a fraudulent predator but hadn't exposed him, and now Lydia was his latest victim. When Mr Darcy found them, he tried to persuade Lydia to return to her family, but she refused to leave Wickham. So he focused on getting them married as soon as possible. Wickham never intended to marry Lydia. He'd fled his regiment to escape his debts and taken her along for the ride. In fact, he still hoped to marry a rich girl in some other part of the country. But Mr Darcy persevered and eventually made Wickham an offer he couldn't refuse. Once that was settled, Mr Darcy met with Mr Gardiner, explained the details of his agreement with Wickham, and insisted on taking care of all the financial matters himself. Mr Gardiner didn't have to pay a penny, but Mr Darcy was happy for him to take all the credit for the positive outcome. Lydia stayed with Mr and Mrs Gardiner in the lead up to the wedding and was, quite frankly, an absolute brat. But the wedding went ahead, and Mr Darcy was perfectly gallant throughout the whole affair. Mrs Gardiner takes the opportunity to tell Elizabeth how much she likes Mr Darcy, and hints that he and Elizabeth would make a great match. Elizabeth now deeply regrets every harsh word she ever said to Mr Darcy, but she's interrupted in her thoughts by Wickham. He tries to make brotherly chit-chat as they walk back to the house, but it's awkward. It's also obvious that he's just trying to find out how much Elizabeth knows. For Lydia's sake, Elizabeth is diplomatic, and as they reach the house, offers him a truce. The Bennets soon bid farewell to Lydia and Wickham as they leave to start their lives in the north. Mrs Bennet is low for a while, until she hears some interesting news. Mr Bingley is returning to Netherfield. After Jane's disappointment, Mrs Bennet swore to never speak of him again, but now she can barely speak of anything else, and poor Jane begins to suffer. To everyone's astonishment, Mr Bingley visits Longbourn very soon after his arrival in the area. And who's that with him? It's Mr Darcy. Gosh, this will be interesting. Remember, only Elizabeth knows that Mr Darcy saved the family from disgrace. Only Jane knows that Mr Darcy proposed to Elizabeth and was refused. And no one knows that Elizabeth now has feelings for Mr Darcy. So, when Mrs Bennet is barely civil to Mr Darcy compared to her fawning over Mr Bingley, Elizabeth burns with embarrassment. It's a weird visit. Bingley is warm and polite, but Darcy doesn't say much at all. He says even less when Mrs Bennet makes a snide remark in defence of Wickham. Oh, cringe. The only positive thing about the visit is Bingley's friendly interaction with Jane. Mrs Bennet jumps at the opportunity and invites both gentlemen to dine at Longbourn in a few days' time. After the men leave, Elizabeth goes for a walk to think. Why did Darcy come if he was just going to sit there like a sack of potatoes? He was so friendly and attentive when she was in Derbyshire. What's changed? Jane joins her and is in good spirits. Now that she's chatted with Bingley, she's more confident in his presence. No one is in danger of falling in love and dinner will be a breeze. But Elizabeth scoffs at this. Bingley's in danger, even if Jane isn't. At the big dinner, Bingley chooses a seat next to Jane, but he seems more alarmed than happy, and Mr Darcy is as reserved and unreadable as ever. He sits far away from Elizabeth, and they barely get a chance to speak all evening. When they do, it's brief, awkward, and disappointing. Mrs Bennet is completely oblivious to all this and considers the dinner a triumph. So much so that she expects Bingley to propose to Jane any day now. Calm down, Mrs B. Of course, Jane is more modest. She expects nothing. But Elizabeth teases her for playing it cool. Love is in the air, and that's that. Is Bingley back on the scene for good? And why has Darcy gone cold again? Stay tuned to find out. We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.